December 10, 1964. Oslo, Norway. The Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. Martin Luther King Jr. receives the medal from the King of Norway. Global cameras. Standing ovation from world leaders. A $54,000 award he'll donate entirely to the movement. But 21 days earlier, an anonymous letter arrived at his home. FBI seal. 9 pages. 1 audio reel. A suggestion that he kill himself. J. Edgar Hoover's agents have tracked King for 847 consecutive days. The letter's author wrote, "There is only one way out for you." While the world celebrates in Oslo, Hoover waits in Washington for news that never comes. King's response has already been sent. Hoover just doesn't know it yet. This is the story of how the most powerful man in American law enforcement tried to destroy a preacher, and how that preacher's response made Hoover's weapon into his own destruction. In 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the absolute peak of public power. The Civil Rights Act had been signed into law that July. President Johnson credited King's movement with making it possible. In October, the Nobel Committee announced King would receive the Peace Prize, the youngest recipient ever at 35 years old. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He had the ear of presidents and the attention of the world. But in Washington, J. Edgar Hoover saw something else entirely. Hoover had run the FBI for 40 years. He had files on senators, presidents, movie stars, and mobsters. He knew secrets that could end careers with a single phone call. And he had decided that Martin Luther King Jr. was the most dangerous man in America. In November, Hoover called a press conference and said it out loud. King was the most notorious liar in the country. No explanation, just venom. The world was shocked. But Hoover had been preparing something much worse. The FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, had been established in 1956 to disrupt organizations Hoover considered threats. By 1962, King was a primary target. The operation against him wasn't subtle. It was industrial. 16 FBI field offices, 8 cities with active wiretaps, 24-hour surveillance. Agents photographed King at airports, hotels, churches, and private homes. They tapped his phone at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference headquarters. They tapped his home phone. They planted bugs in hotel rooms across the country. The Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. Room 101. January 1964. FBI technicians installed listening devices in the walls, the lamps, the telephone. They did this in 16 different hotels. Then they waited. And they recorded. Conversations. Meetings. Private moments. Intimate moments. The FBI spent over $1.2 million annually just on King surveillance. The goal, according to internal memos later released by the Church Committee in 1975, was to neutralize King as an effective Negro leader. William Sullivan, Hoover's assistant director, personally oversaw the operation. And by November 1964, they had what they wanted. 2 weeks before the Nobel ceremony, Hoover made the call. He told William Sullivan, "Send the package." An anonymous letter was typed on an FBI typewriter. This was confirmed years later through forensic analysis. It was mailed from Tampa, Florida, to create a false trail. It arrived at King's Atlanta home on November 21, 1964. Inside the envelope, 9 pages. Single-spaced. No signature. And 1 unmarked audio reel. The letter called King a fraud, an evil man, a hypocrite. It referenced the recordings. It said the world would soon know the truth. And it ended with a countdown. 34 days until your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. The final line was direct. There is only one way out for you. The package was addressed to King's home, not his office. Hoover knew Coretta King usually opened the mail. The cruelty was deliberate. The timing was calculated. Hoover expected King to break privately, withdraw from Oslo, and disappear from public life. Now all he had to do was wait. November 21, 1964. The King family home in Atlanta. Coretta King brought in the mail and saw the envelope immediately. No return address, but she recognized the FBI watermark in the corner. She'd seen it before. She didn't open it. She set it on the kitchen table and waited. Martin was in Birmingham, leading a voting rights meeting. He returned home on November 23rd. Coretta handed him the envelope without a word. They sat together in the living room. He opened it slowly. 9 pages. Typed. Unsigned. The language was venomous. It called him a liar, a fraud, worse. It referenced hotel rooms, dates, recordings, things the FBI couldn't possibly know unless they'd been listening. And they had been. Then Martin played the tape. Partial. Just enough. He recognized the voices. He recognized the locations. He recognized the dates. It was all real. The letter ended with that line. "There is only one way out for you." Coretta looked at him. Martin looked back. And in that moment, they both understood exactly what Edgar Hoover wanted. He wanted Martin Luther King Jr. to kill himself. Before Oslo. Before the Nobel Prize. Before the world saw him as a moral leader. Martin called his inner circle Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, Bayard Rustin. He showed them the letter. He played them the tape. They talked through the night. The question wasn't whether to respond. The question was how. Hoover expected panic. He expected shame. He expected silence. What he got was something else entirely. King made a decision that night that would unravel everything Hoover had built. Late November 1964. FBI headquarters, Washington, D.C. Edgar Hoover sat in his office and waited for the news. He received daily reports. No public statement from Target. Target continues normal schedule. No indication of distress. Hoover was confused. He'd expected an immediate reaction, a press conference, a withdrawal from Oslo, maybe worse. The letter was explicit. The threat was clear. The tape was damning. Why wasn't King responding? William Sullivan's team increased surveillance, 24-hour visual monitoring. Phone taps expanded. They listened to every conversation. They watched every movement. King went to SCLC meetings. He gave speeches. He traveled to fundraisers. He acted like nothing had happened. Hoover started to believe his own narrative. Maybe King was planning a quiet exit from public life. Maybe he'd go to Oslo, accept the prize, and then step back. Disappear into a university somewhere. Let younger leaders take over. That would be victory enough. But King kept moving. He met with journalists. He attended church. He visited with clergy and civil rights leaders. And something strange was happening. People close to King started mentioning recent attempts at intimidation. Not directly. Not with details. Just enough to make people curious. The church committee would later release internal FBI memos from this period. Hoover wrote in one, "Subject appears unaffected by correspondence. Recommend continued monitoring." In another, "Expect delayed reaction. Subject may be concealing distress." He was wrong. King wasn't concealing distress. He was doing something Hoover hadn't considered. He was telling the truth. Not to the press, not in a dramatic public statement, just quietly, to people he trusted. And that changed everything. King's strategy was almost too simple to believe. He didn't hide the letter. He didn't destroy the tape. He didn't act like a man with something to lose. He showed the package to trusted advisors, clergy, journalists he knew personally, civil rights lawyers. He described it plainly. The FBI is trying to blackmail me into killing myself. No drama. No shame. No defensiveness. Just the facts. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't release the tape publicly. He didn't name Hoover directly. He just refused to pretend it wasn't happening. When people asked if he was afraid, he said yes. When they asked if he was embarrassed, he said the FBI should be. And then he continued preparing for Oslo. He booked flights for himself, Coretta, and close family. He wrote his Nobel acceptance speech. He met with advisors about how to distribute the $54,000 prize money. He acted like a man who intended to be in Norway on December 10th. Hoover's surveillance teams captured all of this. The FBI listened to King's phone calls. They watched him pack. They documented his travel arrangements. And they reported back to Washington, subject proceeding with Oslo plans. Hoover didn't believe it. He thought it was a bluff. But here's the twist. King's vulnerability became his weapon. By refusing to act guilty, by treating the blackmail attempt as exactly what it was, he turned Hoover's tactic into evidence of government abuse. The shame Hoover tried to create fell back on the Bureau. The key to beating the blackmail was ordinary. King just refused to cooperate with his own destruction. December 1st, 1964. King gave an interview to a journalist he trusted. He didn't mention the letter specifically. He didn't play the tape, but he said something carefully chosen. "I have recently been given many reasons to disappear from public life. I will not." The journalist asked what he meant. King smiled and said, "There are forces that would prefer a silent Negro leader. I am not interested in being silent." That was all. But it was enough. In Washington, Hoover read the transcript. He told Sullivan, "He's bluffing. He won't go to Oslo." On December 8, 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. boarded a plane to Norway. Coretta sat beside him. His parents, his siblings, Ralph Abernathy, and close advisors filled the rows behind him. The FBI watched him walk onto the plane. They watched it take off. Hoover still expected a reversal, a sudden illness, a canceled ceremony, a quiet withdrawal. But then something else happened. International journalists started asking questions. Why had Hoover called King a liar in November? What was the FBI's relationship with the civil rights leader? Were there ongoing investigations? The questions were vague, but they were persistent. Someone, multiple someones, had been talking. Not with details, not with accusations, just with enough truth to make people curious. This was the second player entering Hoover's game. The press. And unlike King, they had no reason to stay quiet. They started digging. They started asking the FBI for comment. They started calling it a campaign of intimidation. Hoover issued denials, but he was starting to realize something. The blackmail hadn't worked, and now it was becoming a liability. December 10th, 1964. Oslo, Norway. The Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. King stood on the stage in a formal suit. The King of Norway handed him the medal. The audience, world leaders, diplomats, international press rose in applause. King gave his acceptance speech. He talked about nonviolence. He talked about the movement. He mentioned forces of darkness that opposed equality and justice. He didn't name Hoover. He didn't mention the letter. He didn't need to. The speech was broadcast globally. Millions watched. King spoke about moral courage, about continuing the struggle despite threats and intimidation, about refusing to be silenced. He announced that the entire $54,000 prize would be donated to civil rights organizations. Every cent. He wasn't keeping any of it. In Washington, J. Edgar Hoover watched the broadcast, and he understood, finally, that the blackmail had failed completely. King didn't just survive the threat. He was elevated by it. The Nobel Prize gave him international moral authority. The FBI's attempt to destroy him made him more sympathetic, not less. Hoover's tactic had backfired. King returned to America on December 15th. He was met at the airport by crowds, reporters, and supporters. He looked calm. He looked dignified. He looked like a man who had nothing to hide. Because here's the twist that Hoover never saw coming. The threat didn't stop King. It clarified him. It showed him exactly what he was up against. And it proved to him that transparency, not silence, was the only defense. The envelope was still in Atlanta. The letter was still in a safe. And the truth was starting to come out. January 1965. An internal FBI memo leaked. Just a fragment. just enough to suggest that the Bureau had sent correspondence to King before the Nobel ceremony. The leak was small, but journalists noticed. They started investigating. What kind of correspondence? Why? On whose authority? Hoover denied everything. He called the reports fabrications. He said the FBI had no interest in Dr. King beyond routine security monitoring. But the questions kept coming. King's allies had preserved everything. The original envelope, the letter, the tape, the postmark. They documented the chain of custody. They treated it like evidence because that's what it was. Years later, forensic analysis would confirm the letter was typed on an FBI typewriter. The Church Committee investigation in 1975 would release internal memos proving Hoover personally approved the operation. William Sullivan would eventually testify under oath that the letter was real and the intent was exactly what it looked like. But in early 1965, all of that was still hidden. What wasn't hidden was King's response. He had refused to break. He had refused to hide. And that refusal was starting to crack Hoover's carefully constructed wall of deniability. Congressional allies quietly began asking questions. Informal inquiries. Nothing official yet, but enough to make Hoover nervous. Here's how Hoover tried to hide it. COINTELPRO protocols required anonymous mailings, untraceable postmarks, no direct bureau fingerprints, deniable operations. The letter was designed to be a ghost, something King couldn't prove, couldn't fight, couldn't expose. But King's transparency broke the deniability. He shared the letter with journalists, clergy, and lawyers. He created a paper trail that Hoover couldn't erase. He documented everything. In 1975, the Church Committee investigation into intelligence abuses finally forced the FBI to release internal documents, thousands of pages, memos, surveillance logs, recordings, and among them, confirmation of the letter. William Sullivan's testimony was explicit. Yes, the Bureau sent it. Yes, Hoover approved it. Yes, the intent was to neutralize King before Oslo. Sullivan described the operation in detail. The composite tape, the anonymous letter, the countdown, the suggestion of suicide. Hoover's personal notes were found in FBI archives after his death in 1972. One entry, dated November 1964, read, "Package sent. Await results." The chain of evidence was complete. King had kept everything, treated it as documentation, not shame. And when the investigations came, years later, after his death, the proof was there, preserved, undeniable, a complete record of institutional intimidation. King's response wasn't dramatic. It was documentary. He kept the envelope. He kept the letter. He kept the tape in a safe location. He testified about it privately to trusted allies. He never played the tape publicly. That would have hurt others, not just himself. But he used the existence of the threat as proof. Proof that the FBI was surveilling civil rights leaders. Proof that Hoover saw the movement as an enemy. Proof that the government was willing to use blackmail, intimidation, and worse. Hoover's tactic backfired completely. Instead of destroying King's moral authority, it increased it. King became more sympathetic. The FBI's surveillance became the scandal, not King's private life. The surveillance continued. Hoover never stopped. Agents followed King until the day he was assassinated in Memphis in 1968. But the effectiveness was gone. King had exposed the machine. And once exposed, it lost its power. King's strategy was simple. Sunlight, not silence. Transparency, not shame. He treated the blackmail as what it was, an abuse of power. And by refusing to cooperate with his own destruction, he turned Hoover's weapon back on him. The moral authority Hoover tried to destroy became unshakable. From 1965 to 1968, Hoover never publicly admitted FBI involvement. He maintained the denial until his death in 1972. But William Sullivan eventually broke with Hoover over tactics. Other agents quietly expressed discomfort with COINTELPRO methods. The letter became evidence in later civil rights investigations. The 1975 Church Committee used it as a primary example of intelligence abuse. The original envelope, letter, and tape entered the historical record. King was assassinated on April 4, 1968, in Memphis. He was 39 years old. After his death, the FBI letter took on new meaning. It became proof not just of intimidation, but of a government actively trying to silence its greatest moral voice. The personal cost was clear. King lived his final years knowing the FBI wanted him dead, and he kept moving anyway. The envelope, unopened for 3 days in November 1964, now preserved in the National Archives. It contains one of the most explicit government threats in American history. 9 pages, 1 audio reel, a countdown to suicide, signed by no one, sent by the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world. It became evidence, not of King's shame, but of institutional evil. Hoover's reputation was permanently damaged when the full story came out. The FBI's abuse of power became undeniable. The letter that was meant to silence became proof of courage. King's refusal to comply became a historical lesson. The envelope still has the 1964 postmark. There is only one way out, it said. King chose the way forward, and the legend of what he refused to do outlasted everything Hoover built.